In this presentation, we're going to try to get an idea to start off with about what this word existentialism might even mean. We're going to have to circle back around as we go, learning a little bit more each time with each different philosopher that we talk about, exactly what might be behind this big long word existentialism. But let's start with something. And the first something I think we better start with is an admission that maybe there is no such thing as existentialism. If by thing you mean one thing, one school of thought, one set of ideas held in common by a school of thinkers, it's not really true in the case of existentialism. It's kind of an umbrella term, and a lot of thinkers that get lumped under this term existentialism will specifically disavow the term. They'll say, don't call me that. And even the few who do accept the term existentialist will have some reservations about using that term. And there's actually philosophical reasons for that. It's not just being fussy. And so we'll have to take a look at that as we go. But we should bear this in mind, that when we're trying to figure out what existentialism is, it might not just be one thing. It might be more than just one thing, if it's a thing at all. I'll give you a good example of that. The most famous existentialist of all probably is Jean-Paul Sartre. He's the sort of the poster boy of existentialism in the 20th century. And in an interview with Michel Contant, asked him, when he was an older person now, 70 years old, so do you still accept the label of existentialist? And Sartre says, the word is ridiculous. Besides, as you know, it wasn't I who chose it. They stuck it on me, and I accepted it. These days I wouldn't. But no one calls me existentialist anymore, except in textbooks, where it doesn't mean anything. And every textbook calls him existentialist. And Contant says, well, as far as labels go, do you prefer existentialist to Marxist, which is another set of ideas Sartre was interested in? And Sartre says, if a label is absolutely necessary, I would like existentialist better. So I'll take it, but I don't love it. Existentialism is about more than academic philosophy, and I think we can, if we look at the history of philosophy, we could look at two main threads or pathways of philosophy that are distinguishable, but oftentimes interrelated, or more or less interrelated at different times in history. The first is, kind of an academic version of philosophy. The idea of philosophy is to get things right, to try to figure things out, not for any further purposes, but simply to know. Aristotle begins his work, The Metaphysics, all people by nature want to know. And philosophy is an attempt to know, to understand. But the other pathway of philosophy that was there from the beginning was philosophy as a kind of way of life. A philosophical life was a lived life. It was not just about knowing things, not about writing books or giving lectures. It was about living in a certain kind of way. And as you can well understand, knowing the truth, knowing how things are, getting things right can be conducive, maybe an essential element of living a well-lived life. But living a well-lived life is a distinguishable kind of purpose, and philosophy has always had these two kind of purposes. So many of the existentialists were not academic philosophers at all. They were novelists, playwrights, poets, artists. Existentialists has had a wide-ranging influence in films and art and other cultural practices, even by artists or filmmakers who themselves would not take on the label existentialist. The themes that the existentialist thinkers have raised have shown up in novels and plays and films and artworks and so forth. My daughter, who's a corporate attorney, tells me that there's, in her words, a really important case in Delaware corporate law. That's where all the big corporate laws in Delaware. It's called In Re, the Walt Disney Company, Derivative Litigation and Subsequent Related Cases, in which Sartre's book, 800-plus page book, a difficult book called Being in Nothingness, is actually cited. So it's I don't think the corporate lawyers are sitting around being existentialists necessarily, but there is an influence in the culture that's undeniable, more so than in many other flavors of philosophical endeavor. It's a way of life, existentialism is. It's about the care of the self, in the words of Michel Foucault. And you could trace the roots of this idea of caring for the self and living well all the way back to Socrates, if not before. So existentialism is a kind of a new word. It's focused in the 20th century European thought, but it's as old as the hills. Now, just to get us started, I took the liberty of reproducing the thoughts of two different writers about existentialism, their attempt to say in a few words what existentialism is all about. So the first one is Tom Flynn's Existentialism, a very short introduction. It's a whole series of those books called A Very Short Introduction. They're quite well done. Flynn is a Sartre scholar, and so this is his stab at existentialism. First, a formula that we'll see comes from Jean-Paul Sartre. Existence precedes essence. What you are, your essence, what it takes to be the kind of thing you are, your essence, the essence of you, is the result of your choices, your existence, rather than the reverse. Essence is not a destiny. What it is, the essence of a coffee cup, is a kind of a destiny for that kind of object. It is what it is, but you are what you make yourself to be. You're not destined to be one thing rather than another. Time is of that essence of what you are. We are fundamentally time-bound beings. Unlike measurable clock time, lived time is qualitative. The not yet, the already, the present differ among themselves in meaning and value. Humanism is another feature of existentialism, and existentialism is a person-centered philosophy. It's not anti-science. Its focus is on the human individual's pursuit of identity and meaning amidst the social and economic pressures of mass society for superficiality and conformism. Certainly have to talk about that. Freedom and responsibility is a key theme of existentialism, perhaps the key theme. Existentialism is a philosophy of freedom. Its basis is the fact that we can stand back from our lives and reflect on what we have been doing. In this sense, we are always more than ourselves, but we are as responsible as we are free. So that leads to a fifth theme of ethical considerations are paramount. Existentialists, all in their own way, see their existentialist endeavors as having a kind of an ethical motive or motivation or driver. Though each existentialist understands the ethical, as with freedom, in his or her own way, the underlying concern is to invite us to examine the authenticity of our personal lives and of our society. So that's verbatim from Flynn. Now let me give you another shot from Sarah Bakewell. She wrote this wonderful book called At the Existentialist Cafe, a multi-biography of all the figures that we'll talk about in this course and a whole lot more. It's wonderfully written. It's very informative. It's a page-turner. I highly recommend it, At the Existentialist Cafe. Now, her attempt in the early pages of that book to try to give us something to get started with includes that existentialists concern themselves with individual, concrete human existence. They're not into the abstractions. They're not into philosophical concepts so much as it's a reflection on what it means to be not a human being, but you or me. They consider human existence different from the kind of being that other beings have. Other entities are what they are, but as a human, I am whatever I choose to make myself at the moment. I am free, and therefore, I am responsible for everything I do. That's a dizzying fact which causes an anxiety inseparable from human existence itself. We will certainly talk about the concept of anxiety in this course. Very important. On the other hand, I am only free within situations. It's not an abstract free. I'm not free in a vacuum. And those situations which can include factors in my own biology and psychology, as well as physical, historical, and social variables of the world in which I have been thrown. That word thrown, you'll see, will come back in our discussions. And despite these limitations, I always want more. I am passionately involved in my personal projects of all kinds. You can hear in that word project means to throw forward. Our lives are kind of thrown forward into the future. Human existence is thus ambiguous, at once boxed in by borders and yet transcendent and exhilarating. An existentialist who is also phenomenological, another big word we need to talk about, provides no easy rules for dealing with this condition, this dizzying sense of freedom and responsibility, but instead concentrates on describing lived experience as it presents itself. By describing experience well, the existentialist hopes to understand this existence and awaken us to ways of living more authentic lives. The idea of authenticity is a key concept or notion that we're going to have to explore in great detail. So I highlighted here in red terms that are going to return as we talk about the different philosophers. And that's all coming from Bakewell's wonderful book at the Existentialist Cafe. So our goal will be to learn what existentialist thought has to tell us about what it means to be a human being. It's more than this question, and at least for one of our thinkers, it's not even the most important question, but that's going to be our focus, what we call philosophical anthropology, a study of what it means to be human from a certain philosophical vantage point. The central figures will include Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus, although we'll talk about more people than that. One additional way to get started, a very classic way of talking about existentialist philosophy, is to try to counterpoise Heidegger and Sartre kind of up front, so you just give you some parameters of how to think about this. In a way, what's come to be called existentialism can be traced to the differences between the way Martin Heidegger pursued his philosophical quest and the way Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir did as well. Her works have been overshadowed in many respects by the fame of Jean-Paul Sartre. It's unjust. And in fact, we will spend more time reading Simone de Beauvoir's works and talking about her than even Sartre. And I'll try to justify that as we go. But anyway, this may give us a good start. So Heidegger, if you needed to put one word with Heidegger, the word would be being. Being. He was a German, born in 1889, died in 1976, and being was his main focus. What is that? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit, but being is the isness of something, and you and I use the word is or are, and we use those words, that set of words, those being words, all day long. But if I ask you to define it, what does is mean? What does is mean? What does being mean? Well, you try that. I'll let that percolate for you. Heidegger's philosophy was anti-humanistic. I will tell you that there was an intellectual debate carried out at a distance, remotely, socially distant, between Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger. Sartre thought that he understood Heidegger's works, and he gave a famous lecture, which we will read together and talk about, called Existentialism is a Humanism. And a friend of Heidegger says, this French guy just gave this big talk about, what he thinks your philosophy is all about. What do you think? And Heidegger thought about it, and he ended up writing a piece called Letter on Humanism, which is about the size of a small book, explaining why Sartre totally misunderstood him. Heidegger he's not a humanist. If by humanist you mean that what it means to be human determines what being is. And that's going to be very interesting how he kind of talks that through, but he doesn't think that the human, as we understand that term, human, is the determiner of what is and what things mean. He was a right-winger. Let's just get it out there in the open. He was an anti-Semitic Nazi sympathizer. Anti-Semitic in the cultural anti-Semitic way that many, 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 many Germans were. He was a Nazi sympathizer to the point where he liked to wear his little National Socialist pin around, a little uniform. But he thought that what you and I know as the horror of National Socialism was vulgar, basically, in the way he would look at it. He said, well, they're on to something. The Nazis are right to recognize that there is a great problem in the world, but this biologistic thinking of theirs is just, very superficial, vulgar, stupid. If they would just listen to me, I could tell them how to really understand National Socialism. And you'll see, by the way he writes, it's very hard for people to listen to him. It's hard to understand exactly what he's talking about. And certainly all these Nazis in Berlin, they didn't pay the slightest attention. They were happy to have this famous professor on their team, so to speak, but they didn't want to hear a word he had to say. They had their own plans, and they were horrific. And Heidegger was just somebody they couldn't really make heads or tails of. They loved having his name, but they didn't really want to hear much about him. So he was a weird fellow in that regard, and certainly nobody politically to admire in any way. He was a university man. He spent his life as a university professor, lecturer. He was well known as a lecturer. He was very captivating and charismatic. Evidently, they refer to him as the magician of Meßkirch, which is where he was from, because he just held audiences spellbound, even though they may not have actually understood what he was talking about, because what he was talking about was very deep, very profound. He was mystical, but not religious. He was, born Catholic. He married a Lutheran. They tried Lutheran for a while, and then he and his wife both sort of gave up on religion. But he kept something mystical about his views of things. His basic text is the most famous text, revolutionary text, is called Being in Time, Sein und Zeit. It was published in 1927. Under the pressure of trying to get his professorship. The first English translation by Robinson Macquarie came out in 1962, so quite a long time after the original German publication. And there has been now a second translation by philosopher John Steinbaugh in 2010. The standard translations, the first one, almost every second piece of secondary literature article in English talking about being in time is citing from Robinson and Macquarie. So if you can only get one translation, that would be the one to get. Sartre, on the other hand, Jean-Paul Sartre, his word, if you needed one word, would be freedom. He was French-born, 1905 to 1980, and freedom was his word. That's what he wanted to talk about. His thought was about subjectivity and responsibility. He, on the other hand, was a left-winger. He was a Stalinist sympathizer. In fact, long after many of the French, who were predisposed to be favorable towards communists because, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the Russians and the communist Russians fought hard, relentless, horrific battles against the Nazis. So when the war was over, the communists, for the French, like the Americans, looked like the good guys. They were the enemy of the occupier Germans, Nazis. But after a while, it became clear to just about everybody, except maybe Sartre for some reason, that Stalin was, also presenting a horrific version of what communism might mean. So he was kind of far to the other side. Unlike Heidegger, Sartre was a public figure. He could always be found in the cafes or on the picket lines or in the protest marches. He was on TV giving interviews and on the radio and writing for journals. He was a well-known figure, not just in academic life, but in all of culture. He was an atheist, born Catholic, but atheist from almost from the start. For as a young guy, he said he was just a kid, and he just realized, it's not for me. I can't make heads or tails of it. His basic text from the early part of his career, and just like Heidegger, his career changed in his more mature work. But like Heidegger, his fame comes from his early work. So for Heidegger, it was Being in Time. For Sartre, it was a book called Being and Nothingness, which was published in 1943. The first English translation was by Hazel Barnes, came out in 1956. So if you caught that, the English-speaking world learned about this kind of philosophy from Sartre first. It wasn't until a number of years later that Heidegger's work became translated. So really, Sartre had the first foothold in the English-speaking world before Heidegger, and it was always been that way. And there just was published, in fact, I just received it this week. It says it was published in 2018, a new translation, but it just became available. And I picked up this monstrous 800-page book, the new translation. I can't wait to read it next to the Barnes translation, which everybody's been reading for decades. So there's still very much an interest in these texts, and people are still trying to improve on the translations and so forth. They have commonalities. They both had strong women in their lives. Heidegger married Elfrida, with whom they had children. Sartre never married Simone de Beauvoir, but they were soulmates for life. I guess you could call that, and though neither believed they had souls as atheists. But they were lifelong companions. However, both these men had romantic affairs. Heidegger's most famous romantic affair was with a student at the time who is now well recognized as a very important philosopher and political thinker in her own right, Hannah Arendt. Sartre had lots and lots of affairs. He had a deal, in fact, with Simone. We could be with whoever we want, but we need to tell each other everything. That was their promise. That was their vow to each other. We can do what we want because we're free, and it's all about freedom. But because we're special to each other, we need to tell each other everything. And if you read any of their biographies, and their biographies are very interesting, I've read a bunch, they did not always keep that vow of telling each other everything, which was, I don't know, maybe for the best. I don't know. Beauvoir, she had her affairs too, most famously with Nelson Algren, who's a novelist, Claude Lanzmann, the filmmaker. Religion, Heidegger studied in seminary but quit, and as I said, Sartre sort of gave up on religion early on. Heidegger did not like to be grouped with the existentialists. Sartre, as we saw, grudgingly embraced the term. Heidegger had an interest in art. He wrote about art and how art makes manifest being. Sartre was certainly very interested in art, wrote about writing, the purpose of writing, the purpose of literature. He wrote plays, he wrote novels, so he created art, not just talked about it. Ethics, Heidegger, none. Now, that's ambiguous because in some ways, as a person, he had not. He was not really a savory character. He was charismatic, and there were people who kept with him. But even Arendt, who's Jewish, stayed concerned, at least I would say that, with Heidegger for her entire life, his entire life. But Heidegger did not write in ethics. He was not concerned with ethics. You'll see when we talk about him, he uses language that sounds like it comes from the sphere of morality, but he always tries to mean what he says in a non-moral way. It's odd, and we'll see what that looks like. Sartre always wanted to write in ethics. He knew that there was a moral impetus to existentialism, but he just couldn't complete it. Posthumously, there was a big, thick book called Notebooks for Morality that Sartre had been keeping. It was translated to English, but it's episodic. Certainly wasn't finished, but it's something he wanted to do. Beauvoir did much more in this regard of ethics. Her most famous philosophical book, strictly philosophical book, is called An Ethics of Ambiguity. That's what it's not her most famous book, but that's her most important philosophical work. And so she got further. But one of the questions we're going to ask ourselves is, once you figure out what existentialism is all about, what happens to morality? That's a question I want you to really keep in mind. Once you figure out what existentialism is really trying to teach us about ourselves or show us about ourselves, what actually happens to the prospects of morality? We're going to need to talk about that. When it comes to metaphysics, the question of what is the basic nature of reality, Heidegger thinks that metaphysics must be overcome, and we got to stop doing it. We got to stop doing it because we're missing something, and we'll explain that. Sartre, that's not him. He's interested in people. He's not interested in being as such. But just like his French idol, maybe I would call him, René Descartes, the idol of all French philosophy, no matter what. was not interested in metaphysics. Descartes was interested in epistemology. What can I know for sure? What his work did had important implications for metaphysics, or the question of what is there really. Sartre's the same way. He's interested in people and how they live, but the way he understands it, what he sees when he looks at us doing what we do as humans, it has important metaphysical, or to use a similar related word, ontological set of implications, all of which we'll talk about. When it comes to the idea of essence, a human essence, Sartre rejects the idea that we have an essence other than radical situated freedom. He would prefer to talk about our human condition rather than our human nature or our human essence. The human condition is a phrase you hear in Sartre and all existentialists. Heidegger maintains that the human essence is describable. It's finitude. It's a death-bound being, and is hence, using a big word, hermeneutical. Hermeneutics is the science or art of interpretation of texts and also of life. Heidegger says that, we have an essence, but the essence of us is to interpret our essence. And we'll see exactly how that shakes out. Common influence, though, was the philosopher Edmund Husserl, and he's the one who gave us this idea of phenomenology. And I'll give you a little brief overview of what phenomenology is shortly. But phenomenology, to get us started, is the study of the ology of phenomena, the way things show themselves, the way things appear to us, the way we experience things. And Husserl is this pivotal figure. He's really pretty important. If you're a philosophy nerd and you know about 20th century philosophy, there is a divergence, or it had been quite sharp, between what we call Anglo-American analytic philosophy, an English language, English and American type of philosophy that allied itself with science. I like to say that had science envy and logic and the short papers and argumentation, and continental philosophy, the continent being Europe, as that was appropriated by Americans, an interest in the philosophers from the continent, the French and the German, and most importantly, those philosophers were more literary rather than logico-scientific. They were interested in big questions, where Anglo-American was interested in analysis, breaking things down into tinier and tinier kinds of questions. Well, that's a story for another day, an interesting story. Husserl would be one of the pivotal figures that both schools want to look at from time to time as an influence. Some famous existentialists: Søren Kierkegaard, a Dane; Friedrich Nietzsche, German; Miguel de Unamuno, Spanish; Jose Ortega y Gasset, also Spanish; Martin Buber, Austrian, Jewish thinker; Paul Tillich, a German, born in Germany, did most of his important writing in the States as a Protestant; Karl Jaspers, an acquaintance of Heidegger, an important philosopher in his own right; Gabriel Marcel. Some people say that he's the guy who coined the term existentialism. Some of the histories say that, French Catholic. And then various artists, the sculptor Giacometti, playwrights like Ionesco and Beckett, and novelists like Camus, who we are going to talk about, and so on. So the course overview now, to finish this up for today, we've tried to introduce you a little to our subject now, and we're going to next look at some quote-unquote existentialist themes in history, not people or thinkers who call themselves existentialists or even use that word, 'cause it's kind of a new word, but there are themes that we can see. We can see them in the works of St. Augustine and in Blaise Pascal and again in Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And then we'll, as promised, take a look at what Husserl meant by phenomenology and why he thought that himself was going to be the revolution that philosophy has been needing. And in order to do that, we're going to have a little bit of review for some of you, or an introduction for others of you, to the thought of René Descartes and Immanuel Kant, modern philosophy. And then we will spend a week, which is far too little time, on Heidegger's Being in Time. And then another week on Jean-Paul Sartre's Being in Nothingness. And then we'll spend a couple of weeks on Simone de Beauvoir, because she's got a lot to tell us in a lot of different ways. We will have a discussion about Albert Camus and his very timely novel, The Plague, and then we'll take a look at the thought of Lewis Gordon and the idea of black existentialism that may help us think through our current reflections and challenges on the issue of race here in America.